All right, folks, it's 10:30, so we do have a continued packed schedule. That half hour went very, very quickly, but it looks like lots of people were meeting new people, so that's great. It's my pleasure to introduce Christy Jensen from Riverside Martha W. Goodson Center, who will be introducing our next speaker.
Thanks, George. Good morning. Raise your hand. Did you get to meet 2 or more folks just now during the break? Nice job. Nice job. Good brain break. And who had a brain-healthy breakfast? Oatmeal, fruit. So, all right. George had a lot to do with that, so be sure and thank him. So as George said, my name is Christy Jensen. I am in Williamsburg. I'm with what's formerly known as the Riverside Center for Excellence in Aging and Lifelong Health. We have recently experienced a name change thanks to a donor, and we are now known as the Martha W. Goodson Center at Riverside. So my colleagues Denise and Kim are here with me if we can answer any questions about the work that we do as a part of our healthcare system. And part of the work that I do is with Dr. Aravich, who I have the privilege of introducing. Paul's going to be speaking with you from now until about 11:15. If you see me doing things like this, I'm just giving him some friendly hand signals about how much time he has left, because you'll see that there is a panel discussion happening after Paul's presentation and before we have lunch. So we have several things to take care of before our lunch break. But it has been my true pleasure and privilege to get to work with Paul over a number of years. The title of his talk now with us is Brain Health and Dementia Risk Reduction. I think hearing from Bonnie earlier, she's counting on Paul to maybe answer some of the questions that she could not. Paul's bio and background is on the inside back cover of your program, so I'm not going to read that to you. Please know that's just a brief version. If you've ever gotten an email from Paul, his signature is like a mini bio because his credentials are so vast and around brain injury, around Alzheimer's support, around research, anatomy, geriatrics. So I'm going to ask that you take time to read it. I just want to highlight a few things. So you will see in his bio that he gave the first ever TEDx talk at NASA. With NASA. And I asked him about that, and hopefully I can quote you on this. He said to them, and I'm not surprised, that rocket science is for wimps, and the real science is neuroscience. So, you heard him being referenced earlier, and he references himself as the brain guy. And that's because he has had a number of brains that have been donated to research and science and education, and he has traveled with many of those. He doesn't have any to share with you today, but plenty of stories about them. He estimates that at least 10 million individuals have seen these brains as they have traveled around the country. So I thought that was really fascinating. 2 other quick things I just want to share with you about him. If you're familiar with RDRAF, which we're so fortunate to have had in the Commonwealth for since the early 1980s, the Alzheimer's Disease and Research Award Fund, he's been a faithful reviewer every year for the individuals that submit funding proposals for more than 25 years. So we're grateful. He has coached and mentored many students, particularly at the graduate level, but also young researchers. And he was really instrumental to funding that I received, I think, initially from RDRF in 1995. One other thing I want to share with you is about his Birdsong initiative. And this is deploying tablets in nursing homes where he has very faithfully been committed to the belief that nursing home residents should have access to and can use technology in their rooms. So if you haven't heard anything about the Birdsong Initiative, you certainly can ask Paul about that more. So please listen in. The brain guy has a lot in his brain. So I'm sure you are in for a treat and are going to learn a lot. So please help me welcome Dr. Paul Aravich to the podium.
Christy is too kind, and a lot of people in this room are unsung heroes when it comes to fighting for the welfare of older Americans, none more important than Christy. She showed me, for example, her international work with the Carter Center. 4 kinds of people on earth: those who were caregivers, those who are caregivers, those who will be caregivers, and those who will need a caregiver. So I'll use that as much as I can. Thanks, Christy, for turning me on to the family caregiving issues that you lead here in the Commonwealth. And now the Goodson Center is under the very capable leadership of a good friend of many of us, Tina Thomas, who I'll say it again, she's the bomb. And boy, I love working with her. We almost lost her to the National Alzheimer's Association. She worked there for a while with community outreach stuff, but then came back professionally to be with Riverside. Now, when I bring brains to Congress, and I've presented at many Congressional Caucus presentations, you just don't bring a brain to Congress. You've got to go through lots of different approvals. But Capitol Police inevitably tell me when I bring a brain to Congress, thank God we finally have some brains up here. All right, I did want to start by, before I get into the details here, of my interest in the olfactory system as the front door to the brain. And COVID and pollutants and other kinds of things can go right up the nose, into the brain, pretty much go wherever they want to go. And so the nose is something that is worth paying attention to. But I'd like to ask this question: why can it only grow up to 12 inches? And the answer to that question is because then it would be a foot. Then it would be a foot. Pretty catchy, I know. Okay, so let's continue without further ado with a couple of shout-outs. I had the honor of working with Thelma on the Public Guardian Board, which eventually I headed, and on the Virginia Center on Aging at VCU's advisory committee. And in other instances, I never met a person who was more collegial, collaborative, and as a big cheese, nicer. You know, sometimes the higher the person, the worse the personality. Not Thelma. She was a genuine social change agent and leader for the greater good of the community. The first day of the governor's conference, I saw Dick Lindsay. He was sitting in the corner of the big room all by himself. And, you know, he's a little guy like me, and he's got gray hair like me. And I was saying, my God, this is the guy who put geriatrics on the map in Virginia. And nobody seems to know who he is. And so I wanted to give a shout out to Dick. And then from the Virginia Center on Aging at VCU, shout outs to 2 persons who've retired that I work with very extensively. Ed Ansello, he brought in so much funding, expanded so much the services of the Virginia Center on Aging at VCU. And my friend Connie Kugel, who is retired as of May 4th. They're all social change agents and leaders for the greater good of the community, to quote medical educator Flexner. So I wanted to give my high fives to them. Wherever I speak, whether it's on Capitol Hill or not, I like to talk about the brain as the universe between our ears, and that's the book I've been writing for the last 25 years. They tell me, though, the secret to writing a book is you got to get your butt in a chair, and I just never get my butt in a chair, but that's the book I've been writing. There's the link below on the TEDx NASA talk, and the last frontier of science is clearly behavioral neuroscience. What do we mean by dementia? What do we mean by schizophrenia? What do we mean by depression? That's the last frontier of science. You see on the right 2 brains that many millions of people have seen, and when I go to General Assembly or Capitol Hill, members fight over because they want to hold and get their picture taken with it, as if they really support the Alzheimer's and dementia and brain injury stuff, or perhaps it's a photo op, but hey, you reach people any way you can. So there's an Alzheimer's, a person diagnosed clinically with Alzheimer's, and there's a fatal traumatic brain injury. And that one below is the one that more people than any have seen in my travels across the United States. And I used to be the the head of the Virginia Brain Injury Council, and people don't know that traumatic brain injury is a major risk factor for all forms of dementia. So when I give TBI talks, TBI people come. When I give dementia talks, dementia people come. But getting the two together has been quite a problem, and I'll talk more about silos a little bit later. Oh, how far can you see? Get the great square of Pegasus on your laptop. Figure out where it is in the night sky. Even here in Richmond, go off one of the corners and see a little speck of light. That is the Andromeda galaxy that is way bigger than the Milky Way galaxy. And that light left the galaxy 2.5 million years ago. So who says you can't go in the past? Just open your eyes. Unfortunately, Goethe tells us we are our whole lives blind. Don't open our eyes. We don't awaken our brains to all this wondrous and beautiful, majestic, simple stuff, if only we would see it. All right, so let's talk about types of brain injuries as I set this up. We can talk about congenital brain injuries like cerebral palsy, Fragile X, Down syndrome, and so on. Talk about acquired brain injuries like stroke and traumatic brain injury, oxygen insults secondary to heart attack or near drowning, infections, meningitis, a variety of acquired brain injuries. The degenerative brain injuries that include, but are not restricted to the dementias, but also include Parkinson's and Huntington's and so on and so forth. And then I like to describe substance use disorders as a brain injury, and you want to go toe-to-toe with me, I'll be there with 40 days and 40 nights showing you the overlap in the pathophysiology with excitotoxic amino acids and inflammation stuff and all of these things consistent with the conclusion that substance use disorders and also serious mental illnesses are brain injuries. And so the interesting thing about all of these is they're incestuously related. So persons with Down syndrome have an increased risk of Alzheimer's. We know substance use disorders increase the risk of the dementias, and in particular, the two most deadly drugs on earth, they don't know on Capitol Hill that they're even drugs: tobacco and alcohol. How much alcohol are people now saying we should drink? Zero, zip, nada. And if you want the red wine, resveratrol sounds like geritol, fountain of youth out there, I'm told just boil, 8 ounces of peanuts. I'm a Yankee. I'm not a devotee of boiled peanuts, but you get pretty much the same amount of that resveratrol in boiled peanuts as you can in a glass of red wine. So binge on the peanuts, don't binge on the alcohol, particularly if you're older, you have issues, frailty, et cetera, and so forth. They're all incestuously related. Ann McDonald, the former head of the Brain Injury Association of Virginia, and myself and others presented at the World Brain Research meetings last fall about an important at-risk group for all forms of dementia, those with traumatic brain injury. And if they're at risk, then they in particular should be taking advantage of some of the prevention strategies that I'll be outlining here. But again, silos are a real impediment, as is the case for so many things. All right, now let's talk about, as I get into the meat and potatoes part of this, that the world's largest minority group, according to the United Nations, is persons with chronic disabilities. And the most prevalent of the chronic disabilities are number 1, psychiatric, and number 2, neurological. If you want to deal with minority health issues, you cannot forget about the stigma and barriers to care, access to care issues that people with psychiatric and neurological disorders face. And a common denominator of persons with disabilities is we throw them away. Psychosocial deprivation. Go to church, mosque, synagogue, temple like nobody on earth, but God forbid we'd visit the caregiver next door or we'd help the care recipient in some way or another. I'm going to have more to say about isolation and how it injures the brain in a moment. Now that means we have a cultural issue by way of diversity, because persons who are dealing with dementia, persons with serious mental illnesses, persons dealing with substance use disorders, you've seen one person with any of those, you've seen one person with any of those. And so we need to promote cultural humility in regards to the disability population, just like we need to promote it with racial and ethnic issues and poverty issues and so on and so forth. Patrick Kennedy the son of Ted Kennedy and former representative from Rhode Island, has a site called Psych Hub, which is a really interesting, high-impact way to talk about issues related to behavioral health. He contacted me a while ago about going beyond substance use disorders, serious mental illness, and intellectual disabilities, and help those guys put some programs together on the dementias and on various types of brain injury. But then I got a really big CDC grant and on challenging behaviors in nursing homes, and I sort of, we're going a different way. But per the speaker that was one of the keynotes at lunchtime, what you want to do is go on the web by way of YouTube. That's where you're going to get the biggest bang for your buck. And when you do webinars, I'm sorry, been there, done that, you know, it's like, okay, maybe I'll do the webinar, but Seinfeld's on, I got to watch the Soup Nazi, you know, and that kind of stuff. So YouTube is really where the action is, and I think our previous speaker would agree with that. So cultural humility is something we need to appreciate. That's a precursor to cultural competency. You got to reflect all the time. Am I treating the person in a wheelchair as a wheelchair-bound person, or am I treating the person in a wheelchair as a person who happens to be in the wheelchair? We always got to be thinking about and learning and adjusting. It's a lifelong process, cultural humility. That Psych Hub that Patrick Kennedy is leading is a great place for that. Now as I continue to develop the issue of breaking down silos, let's see if some of the dementia-friendly stuff and some of the programs that relate to aging could overlap with persons who have disabilities and coincidentally may be at risk for the dementias. And so let's talk about the 4 M's. 4 M's is a big, in geriatric gerontology stuff, a big issue. First part of that is what matters. That's person-centered care. Person-centered care, critically important for everybody that we're trying to help. Person-centered care, what matters. Medications. Are you on the right medications? If you're an older person, the Beers list said you shouldn't be on antipsychotics for a long time. And more importantly, are you over-medicated? And that whole restraint of challenging behaviors pharmacologically is still at epidemic levels, particularly in nursing homes. You've got to reduce the pharmacological restraints and pay attention to behavioral management and crisis intervention techniques. What about the mentation? This is cognitive and emotional suffering. Have you picked up on a depression? Has the depression been correctly diagnosed or misdiagnosed as a dementia? All of these kinds of things. Why is the person cognitively impaired? Are they cognitively impaired? How do you test this stuff out? That's not just for dementia, that's for everything else. My medical students who are having difficulty academically, I don't ask, are you studying or are you just watching Seinfeld reruns all day? I start thinking, my index of suspicion is, I wonder if there's depression here, I wonder if there's some other kind of social determinant of health, if the primary caregiver for a grandparent and they're up all night long. And so we need to figure out what's going on with the problematic issues that they're facing. And then mobility, of course. If your driver's license is taken away from you because you have dementia and you live in most of Virginia that is not DC, as a philosopher once said, you are screwed, blued, and tattooed as far as lack of public access to transportation and so on is concerned. All right, that's our 4 M's. Now, George Worthington, oh, by the way, I didn't thank everyone, George, as well as the steering committee for giving me the honor to be in front of you, so thank you for doing that. But George is the statewide leader for the Dementia Friendly America effort. There's really trying to build communities around persons who have dementia, but the same pedagogy that works for the dementias also is going to work for intellectual disabilities, also going to work for substance use disorders and so on. Particularly like the part of it that you presented, George, at the Southern Gerontological Society meeting about the language, that way you speak and how you approach persons with dementias, pretty much is the same way you should approach persons who have other kinds of cognitive impairments. And so I see dementia friendly is also disability friendly. And we got to get under one umbrella all of these advocacy groups and all of these efforts. Now, let's talk about successful aging and that it's a brain thing. So, successfully aged persons are not healthy sitting in a rocking chair watching Gilligan Island reruns all day long. That's not successful aging. Successfully aged persons are persons who are socially and productively engaged in the world around them. And so lots of persons who, for example, are retired are fierce advocates and supporters of all kinds of unmet needs in our community. Those are the kinds of persons we want to model, promote, develop a resilience for that can promote true successful aging. Now, we adopted my wife's aunt at the age of 65 when her primary caregiver died and nobody else in the family wanted Aunt Helen with her intellectual disability. And one of the things she could do is see the National Geographic magazine. It was a wondrous thing for her to look at the pictures in the National Geographic. And so we had this routine once a week when it came. It was the highlight of her life, except she was a savant for the opera. And boy, she rubbed off on me and others. Please don't give me Wagner, though I cannot cope with Wagner. But, you know, she had skills that you don't see unless you look for. She was not just intellectually disabled. She had other gifts. She was a saint, frankly. And one of the times we were reading the National Geographic, I got that picture. And I said to myself, that is the model of successful aging. I'd love to know that woman. And I showed this picture for many years now to my medical students, and one student said, I know that woman, she's my friend's grandmother, she lives in Northern Virginia, here's her email. So she and I were emailing back and forth to come down to Eastern Virginia Medical School and model successful aging. Check out those beads. How about that twinkle in her eye? Wouldn't you want to just talk to her about her lived experience? It just seems very rich to me. Well, just a few weeks before she died, in my last email to her, I asked her, what is the key to successful aging? And to translate her response, pursue the unexpected opportunities life offers. Unexpectedly, she flew airplanes with Amelia Earhart before women were supposed to wear pants. Unexpectedly, she was the White House correspondent for the New York Tribune media population. She said everything meaningful to her came completely and unexpectedly. In the words of Goethe again, we live and have our whole lives blind. Don't open our eyes and look for unexpected opportunities. And if you think about that, ponder that, unexpectedly, you guys are in this room right now. Hopefully, that's because you want to be here. This is where your passions led, but it was a curved and circuitous and bumpy road that you traveled to get here. Successful aging. Now, we don't fear aging, truth be told. We fear senescence. So let me distinguish the two for you. When we talk about aging, we're just talking about a developmental life stage, and I don't know about you guys, you couldn't pay me $1 million to be a teenager again. No, thank you, I am not. That's the scariest developmental stage that is out there, if you ask me. We fear senescence. It's a programmed loss of fitness, cellular fitness, related to suicidal stuff called apoptosis and inflammatory cytokines and a bunch of other things. We fear senescence. We don't fear aging. Just because you're older doesn't mean you have to be senescent. And so I want to fight that battle against senescence. And what we need to know is that aging, are you ready for this, is not a disease. Though Silicon Valley, truth be told, is trying to cure aging. They're trying to cure aging. And, you know, if you want to talk about negligible senescers and you want to cure aging, go to the Chesapeake Bay and crack open an oyster. That is a critter that shows minimal senescence over its lifetime. You might ask, if it's a minimal senescer, how come the oyster population's been decimated? That's the external factors, overfishing, pollution, and all that stuff. So frankly, instead of going to Silicon Valley, go to get some raw oysters down the street here, and that's the fountain of youth, in my opinion. Ponce de Leon was, spent too much time down in Florida. He should have been up here in Virginia checking out that stuff. All right, so let's do this scenario where we have a castle that is our brain. And we got some bad guys attacking it. I'm going to call them the Visigoths. You remember the Visigoths? Even Attila the Hun was afraid of the Visigoths. They were real bad guys. And so these bad guys, these Visigoth senescent marauders, inflammation, excitotoxicity, all kinds of different marauders are trying to attack our brain, trying to attack our castle. So conveniently, we have a moat. A buffer zone to protect us against those bad guys, and that's in box 3, where that moat is there to our benefit. It maintains itself throughout our whole life, but shrinks as we get older. As a result, there's less of a capable defense against the senescent Visigoths that are attacking us. But what the key to successful aging is to strengthen the moat, strengthen the barrier against these Visigoths. How do you do that? You promote brain fitness. How do you promote brain fitness? What you eat, how you exercise your brain, how you exercise your body, whether you're socially engaged or not. And so that's what we're talking about when we're talking about prevention. Just because you're old does not mean you have to have Alzheimer's disease. That's a stereotype. Oh, I'm 90, I must have Alzheimer's disease. For the most part, there's a whole bunch of people that are very old who do not have dementias and Parkinson's disease. The reason age is a risk factor is because this buffer zone has been compressed, and we need to strengthen that buffer zone. Now, let's talk about some of the normal and abnormal changes that occur with cognition as we get older. On the figure, you can see that around the age of 20 is when short-term memory peaks. We call that fluid intelligence. So God forbid you're a 40-year medical student in my class as opposed to a 20-year-old medical school student in my class. On a binge purge short-term memory exam, and that's how we teach MDs, binge purge short-term memory. Who's going to, everything else being equal, who's going to do better? It's going to be the 20-year-old person, not the 40-year-old person. But in a complementary way, what does the older person have that the younger person doesn't have? Maybe their short-term memory, their fluid intelligence has declined. But are you ready for this? Life experience. And so who do you want taking care of you if you have some critical medical problem? Some rookie right out of medical school? Or somebody with maybe 20 years of experience? I know who I would prefer in that regard. Now, it is normal, therefore, to show a certain decline in cognitive function, like short-term memory, fluid intelligence. It is not normal to show more worsening of that, which is called mild cognitive impairment, also called mild neurocognitive disorder. Some of us would, in the lay world, would describe it as brain fog. Got a chemo brain, I got a COVID brain. Brain fog is how many of us articulate that in the lay world. That isn't impairing us as far as our activities of daily living is concerned, but it's clearly troublesome and witnessed by family members and so on. Many causes of mild cognitive impairment. One of many is a precursor for Alzheimer's disease. But depression can cause brain fog, COVID can cause brain fog, chemotherapy can cause brain fog, mild cognitive impairment. So we have to appreciate, yes, mild cognitive impairment is a risk factor for example, Alzheimer's disease, particularly if you have this gene modification called apolipoprotein E4, ApoE4. But the fact of the matter is that's only one of several. So you get the diagnosis of MCI, are you doomed to Alzheimer's? No, you're at risk for it, but there could be other underlying causes, which is why you never go to a primary care doc for the diagnosis of these kinds of cognitive deficits. They are not trained. You go to experts. You don't know who the experts are, you go to the Alzheimer's Association chapter near you. They know who the experts are. Not every Tom, Dick, and Harry is able to diagnose these subtle cognitive differences. Geriatricians who are specialized in this, neurologists who are specialized in this, neuropsychologists who are specialized. These are subspecialties within those different clinical domains. Now, one fact that is not appreciated is that as we age, normally, we all have these plaques and tangles. The plaques are extracellular debris filled in brown there, made of a protein that is clumping called amyloid beta protein, A-beta. And the yellow guys are the tangles where the railroad tracks inside the neurons get all clogged and nutritional factors and metabolic factors can't go back and forth to allow cellular function to occur. It is a fact. We all develop plaques and tangles as a function of aging, particularly in certain areas of the brain, like the temporal lobe, where something called the hippocampal formation is. Did I say hippopotamus? No, I said hippocampus. Women in the room might be interested to know two beneficial things if you come back as a female hippocampus. One thing is the spouses, quote unquote, the males, are monogamous so you don't have to worry about that. Better yet, the males deliver the babies. I can't beat that, right? So if you want to come back as a critter, come back as a hippocampus. And they're in the Chesapeake Bay, they're out in the ocean, they're everywhere. It's a pretty interesting thing. One of my mentors is the jellyfish woman of the world. And she had 2 space shuttles where she put her jellyfish up on space, but not the ones that are the Medusa stage, the precursors to that, called the Aravich stage. She was doing biological research before women were supposed to be doing that, and she was working on creatures nobody cares about. And what she was doing was her thing, her passion, and that's why she's a mentor of mine. And so now what are we doing? We're collaborating with some investigators in Italy on using what we've developed as a new model of Parkinson's disease using this very simple nervous system. And what we're going to do is concuss them, I think at Naval Medical Center, Portsmouth, to mimic, quote, brain injury, because TBIs are a major risk factor for Parkinson's. And then we're going to use these Italians' antioxidant that they have and see if that protects against the development of our model of Parkinson's on Earth. And if it does, they already got an experiment up on a space shuttle. We're going to be putting another space shuttle experiment up there. And so my research goes from jellyfish to nursing homes, as I'll show you here in a moment. It's an unusual combination, but I'm proud of that. So everybody gets blacks and tangles. And starting with the Chicago nun studies, tons, excess numbers of plaques and tangles were shown not to be associated with dementia. Now, there's a whole world of Alzheimer's research in particular focused on the amyloid beta cascade hypothesis. We call those persons who are riveted on that the A-beta mafia, amyloid beta mafia. They train in the A-beta labs, they do postdocs, and they get major funding, and it's all about amyloid beta is the cause of Alzheimer's disease. But there are others who live and die in the world of the tauopathy, the tangle stuff that we're talking about here. And then there's a third group. They're not the Baptist, beta amyloid protein. They're not the Taoists. They are instead the otherists. And many of us are increasingly seeing the causes of particularly Alzheimer's disease as being way more complicated than simply amyloid beta. All right, now let's talk about the criteria for dementia itself. And there are different diagnostic approaches to deal with that. But in all of the 2 major ones, you have to have issues that impair your daily activities. You have to be impaired by your cognitive memory function and your other cognitive domains. And then what are the cognitive domains? Recent memory. Another one is going to be language. Yet again, memory and learning issues. The issues of executive function. You put your iron in the refrigerator. You use poor judgment when people are soliciting money from you. Those kinds of things, poor planning. And then personality changes. According to the Alzheimer's Disease and Related Disorders Association, commonly known as the Alzheimer's Association, the diagnostic criteria will, for all forms of dementia, without being specific, require 2 of those domains to be impaired. Notice I said 2, I didn't say memory. Hence, memory impairment is not necessary for the diagnosis of all dementias. It is related to Alzheimer's, but I'll show you in a moment, there are other dementias that have no memory impairment or minimal a loss of 2 of those domains by experts who know how to do the testing and so on as necessary. The impairment needs to decline progressively and slowly with a gradual onset, and it can't be due to issues that relate to the Ds. Can't be delirium, which is a rapid fluctuation change in cognition, and can't be depression. We talk about the 3 Ds. Is the person depressed, and that's why they're cognitively impaired? Is the person going through delirium, and that's why they're cognitively impaired? Or does the person have dementia? And it takes an expert to really sort out those kinds of things. Okay, now, probable Alzheimer's by way of the ADRA criteria requires that you have the impairment, and it progressively declines, it has a gradual onset, and so on. And deficits in these particular domains of memory and judgment and visual spatial stuff, plus one of the other two domains, personality change or issues that relate to language. So you got to have 4 out of the 5 domains I just mentioned, according to this diagnostic criteria, to have the clinical diagnosis of Alzheimer's disease. Now, the American Psychiatric Association has a different nomenclature and a different diagnostic criteria. They do not call the dementias dementias. As my friend Annette Clark points out from the Behavioral Health and Developmental Services, dementia means without brain or without mind. It's a very pejorative term by way of its etymology. Instead, general major neurocognitive disorder is a less pejorative term and preferred. So it's a source of confusion. People will say, well, do I have Alzheimer's or Lewy body dementia, or do I have Alzheimer's or Lewy body major neurocognitive disorder? It's a source of confusion for people. Short answer is they're synonyms for one another. You can see here the cognitive domains they have. They particularly focus in the DSM-5 on social interactions and social abilities. So similar kinds of cognitive domains, but not quite the same. And the diagnosis for all-cause dementia, without being specific, is going to be related to a serious impairment in one of those. Now, when I get my brains that I take around the country, they come from the Anatomical Gift Act program in Virginia, where donors donate their bodies so others may learn, and I believe I honor that in a respectful way by taking brains. What we're seeing increasingly is the cause of death by pathologists or primary care people, dementia. We're seeing all-cause dementia. Well, please tell me, is it Alzheimer's? Is it Lewy body? What kind of dementia? And, you know, I think it's a problem that we're getting a little short on the accurate diagnosis of the types of dementias that are out there. Now, there are the reversible kinds of dementia, which, if diagnosed properly, are, just as the name applies, they are reversible. And God forbid that you are misdiagnosed with Alzheimer's disease when you have a reversible dementia. The number one most frequent cause is polypharmacy, because the nephrologist doesn't know what the cardiologist is doing, who doesn't know what the orthopedic surgeon is doing. And so you got people on 20, 30 drugs that adversely interact. And that's where geriatricians, for example, at the annual Medicare wellness checkup, have to sort out all of that and get rid of those different things. Now, let's talk about issues that relate to vitamin deficiency, malnutrition. These things have to be ruled out, thyroid deficiency, in order for you to move forward with the diagnosis of some sort of dementia. Now, here are the irreversible dementias, the more frequent ones, Alzheimer's by far being the number one most prevalent, but there are 3 others listed here, and we could give you more than a dozen yet other kinds of dementias, all kinds of dementias. That's an umbrella term that includes a whole bunch of different pathologies. So the most prevalent is Alzheimer's disease, and the late onset is much more frequent than the so-called early onset. Vast majority of persons with Alzheimer's disease are older persons, and they must have the domains I mentioned, including memory impairment. Now, the next one I have listed here is vascular dementia, usually from small vessel strokes, occasionally from large vessel strokes. Notice in the red box, you don't have to have a memory problem to have vascular dementia. As we go down the line, we have Lewy body dementia. These are little clumps of protein that go into the cell, and they're associated with a particular protein called alpha-synuclein. And Lewy body dementia is way different than the others. In Lewy body dementia, for example, vivid hallucinations will happen, and there'll be features of Parkinson's disease associated with it early on before they develop frank Parkinsonism. And then we have frontal temporal dementia. None of us want that. None of us want to be a caregiver for a person with frontal temporal dementia. This is where you have tremendous impulse control issues, challenging behavior issues, really difficult issues to manage. And then we can talk about, for example, the chronic traumatic encephalopathy that the New York Times made popular. Those of us in the brain injury movement debate whether there really is a chronic traumatic encephalopathy. Some of us argue that it's a variant of frontal temporal dementia, but certainly you don't want any of these to happen. Okay, now, I want you to understand that Alzheimer's disease in particular is a women's health issue, and many women don't know that. 2/3 of people with Alzheimer's are women. I'll show you a little more data on that later. I want to show you that vascular dementia and Lewy body dementia are predominantly men, and then we can talk about the frontal temporal, and that's equally distributed between males and females. So the sex is a term for biological differences, gender is a sociological term for who you identify with, but the fact of the matter is that there are sex differences across the different types of dementia. Now let me ask you this question, which is probably not well known. Which brain produces more estrogen? Yeah, I know the ovaries produce estrogen, so does adipose tissue, so the kidneys, lots of other sources of estrogen production, including the brain. So you might ask, which brain, the male brain or the female brain, produces more estrogen? Short answer is the male brain. The male brain produces more estrogen than does the female. It's testosterone, then it gets converted by an enzyme into estrogen. The male brain produces more estrogen than does the female brain. And so is that why there is the more predominant effect on women than men, at least for Alzheimer's? I don't know, but it's an interesting paradoxical statement there. Okay, so now what I want to do is a George Costanza thing on Seinfeld, leave them wanting more. So this is all recorded. I understand it'll be on the DAR site, so you can check this stuff out. So I'll just give you a highlight of some of the places that I want to go to. Okay, what did I do? What did I do wrong? Technology, you cannot live without it, and you can't live with it. Okay. Whoops. All right, the rusty truck. You can't put Humpty Dumpty all together again once everything falls apart. And that's where we have to attack the dementias sooner than later. And that's where the prevention stuff is all of the new rage. And we have these stages that present themselves well before the person becomes symptomatic. Biomarkers to identify that, other ways to identify the precursor stages to the full-blown dementia. So we prevent that rusty truck from coming all together again. There's a bunch of theories for Alzheimer's we don't have to go into, except we got the Baptist theory, we got the Taoist theory, we got the otherist theory, and I think it's way more complicated than one thing or another thing. I think it's a big mix of different things. The issues that I find very interesting are changes in gene expression that start over a lifetime as we're hit with domestic abuse, we're hit with prenatal care problems, we're hit with child issues and drugs and that kind of hit after hit after hit, changes gene expression, and then eventually I think you hit a threshold. And to me that epigenetic, as it's called, theory is one way to go. There are metabolic theories and others. So what I like to think about are the seeds of the dementias planted gestationally. And I would argue there's evidence to suggest that, as in the citation here. So I will say to you that the first geriatricians, therefore, are the obstetricians. Good prenatal care, reducing insults during the prenatal period, or promoting good development in the prenatal period, that's going to set the stage for stuff that happens 60, 70, 80, 90 years later. Now, just because you have dementia doesn't mean you're going to have it as necessarily when you're old. So here's some data, and all of these numbers on percents and so on will vary from study to study. And so I have the specific citations here. 10% of persons over 65 are going to have dementia. That means most don't. Now, if you look at persons who are with mild cognitive impairment, 20% or so are going to have mild cognitive impairment, which may be a precursor to the dementias or may have other causes. And then if you look at the persons in their early 70s, it's up to 3%. Persons who are in their late 80s, around 22%. And persons who are in their 90s, around a third. What does that mean? And you're 90 years old, 2/3 of persons are not going to have it. So it is not an inevitable consequence of aging. Here's the differences between males and females. The same risk is associated with each of those sexes up until about the age of 80, and then boom, females really split out, and by the time they're at 80 years of age, have more than twice the risk of developing Alzheimer's or other dementias compared to men. Women's health issue, we got to really put that on the map. Just like stroke is a women's health issue, heart attack is a women's health issue. So who's more likely to have a stroke or a heart attack, a man or a woman? Answer, the hunter-gatherers, the men, because where are the women? Barefoot in the kitchen. Wrong. That is a sexist stereotype. Women more likely to die from a heart attack. Women more likely to have a stroke. Women more likely to have Alzheimer's disease. Now, minority health. The earlier speaker commented on the disparities that are there. Alzheimer's Association has some pretty innovative programs there by way of minority outreach to different stakeholder groups there. And I saw Katie's here somewhere from the Southeastern Virginia chapter of the Alzheimer's Association. There's this wonderful intergenerational program with the Thurgood Marshall College Fund and the Alzheimer's Association to get college students from historically black colleges and universities to be community ambassadors and eventually go out in an intergenerational way, be ambassadors for greater awareness. Social determinants of health, you can't talk about anything without talking about poverty and discrimination and health insurance. Medicaid in Virginia now, as most of you know, is called Cardinal Care. And Cardinal Care has some pretty interesting features, including, for example, what used to be called CCC Plus, patient-centered medical home for complex needs. Now what's going to happen is when people enroll in Medicaid, the severity of their complex needs will be factored in and they'll be automatically placed there. Georgia's given me one of these things. So let me continue here that I've been proud to serve and represent on Capitol Hill the Congressional Brain, the American Brain Coalition. All of these different groups that compete against others in a zero-sum way are under one umbrella. And so I bring my brains up there, represent the American Brain Coalition, and talk about the epidemic of fatal behavioral and fatal neurological disorders as a way to put under one roof all of these different silos. You know, the African proverb, you want to run far or fast, do it alone. You want to go further, run together. Now, this is I think, the main modifiable risk factors that were published in the Lancet Dementia study. To me, these 12 things are the ones we should be focusing on. Is sleep on there? No. Could it be on there? Maybe with greater strength of evidence. But notice what you will, that we need to focus on our diet, and as was mentioned earlier, the MIND diet, which is high in fruits and vegetables and grains and omega-3 fatty acids and olive oil. We can talk about the need for physical exercise. The diabetes prevention trial 30 years ago showed you walk 30 minutes a day, 5 days a week, and watch what you eat. That's all. You can reduce conversion from prediabetes into diabetes by, forgot what was, 50, 60%, with no weight loss in that particular site. So let's start low and go slow instead of pushing high intensity kinds of stuff, which is a barrier if you don't have access to gyms and so on. Let's start thinking about starting low and going slow. Cognitive exercise was pointed out in the first talk. Goes way beyond crossword puzzles, which frankly I don't care about. How can you exercise your brain? Any number of ways. Work with the local Alzheimer's Association, work with homeless persons, try to work with under-resourced kids. Are you ready for this? Laugh. It's remarkable the amount of brain power necessarily to laugh. I'm particularly interested in the part of the brain called the salience network that is protected in the end stages of Alzheimer's disease, sitting there waiting to be fired. So practice your stupid jokes with each other and with persons who have dementia. And, you know, if you say to somebody, what color is the White House, that you might get a rise out of them or you might get a slap from them, but the fact of the matter is practice your stupid jokes. When we talk about the social brain, we're talking about the human brain. We are programmed to be with other people, not on Facebook, not on Twitter. We are programmed to be with other people. How many are alone and isolated and don't have that? That's part of social justice to me, is to get them more mainstream. We talk about the number one environmental cause for all forms of dementia, traumatic brain injury, helmets, seatbelts, not driving sleep deprived, falls. Fall prevention is the #1 cause of those kinds of issues. We can talk about hearing. We had a booth just the last couple of days from the Department for Hearing and Visual Handicapped Persons. Why is hearing such the risk factor that it is? And how can we partner with the hearing and visually impaired to try and mitigate that kind of thing? Also, want to very quickly, George, I'm getting ready to punch out here now. We can focus on issues that relate to cardiovascular risk factors. What's good for the heart is good for the brain. What's bad for the heart is bad for the brain. Diabetes, hypertension, things. Alcohol. Give it up. Forget it. Particularly if you're older. 1 glass a day with resveratrol, forget it. That's what many people are starting to say. COVID. We came through a COVID epidemic, and long COVID, mark my words, in 5-10 years, we're going to see a real increase in various forms of dementia because of what it did to the brain years before that. Okay, I have here for you my version of the MIND diet. And I want you to know that it is designed for weight loss. And people who go on that oftentimes get off of it because they're hungry. If you don't need to lose weight, then don't worry about these particular portion sizes. So the MIND diet suppose a couple of handfuls of nuts a day, a couple of handfuls of berries a day. You know what? It's okay if you're not overweight to take, more than that. And I want to make a cause here for obesity. Good nutrition is one thing, obesity is another thing. There's a J-shaped function with obesity. That is to say, it increases the risk of Alzheimer's and other dementias to a point. But in older age, increased adiposity is good, not bad, good. It's a J-shaped function. So we see obesity as a monolithic and when it's not. Okay, so some of the ways we can exercise our brain so that George doesn't exercise his brain by way of stress and the glucocorticoids. I'm not going to hurt you anymore, George, and I'm going to now stop. Probably not enough time for questions, but hey, hit me up anywhere. I'm not opposed to even around the urinals talking to people, so just thank you.
Might frighten a few people there, Paul. Thank you so much, Dr. Aravich, for that excellent speech. And
so you're giving me the hook, is that right, George?
I'm sorry we don't have time for Q&A, but at this point, but Dr. Aravich will be available during lunch, and I believe you're here all day, right, Paul? Yes, perfect. So make sure you get him to get your questions answered.